Caucus. And then, of course, Mike Zalewski, a Democrat from Riverside, one of the top committee chairmen, revenue, that handles many of the budget issues that go on in Springfield. And two guys that I think everyone across the aisle would agree are two of the nice guys in Springfield. So I'm happy to have both of you with us, and happy to have a good discussion without calling each other names and stuff.
Well, you never know.
Yeah, I was going to say, you're making a lot of promises, Pat.
All right, well, we'll see how it goes. I mean, we haven't gotten totally into politics yet. So yeah. I want to look back first before we kind of turn the page to 2022. And Mike, I'm going to start with you. Since this was a Democratic-led initiative that was to repeal the parental notification of abortion statute, this was a hot topic, but it happened kind of right before the Thanksgiving Christmas window, so a lot of people may have missed it. And you're a parent too, so I'm interested in your perspective here. That when a parent needs to sign a consent form for a kid to go on a field trip, doesn't that just seem a little much to take away their involvement in the process in something as important of a medical decision as an abortion?
Yeah, it does. The thing about the parental notice bill that I think was really difficult to navigate was the process, which is this judicial intercept process, where a young lady has to go in and explain to a judge why she cannot tell her parents. That was, the process has been in place since, I think, the moratorium on the enforcement of the law had been in place. And what the data we'd gotten was that it happened most of the time the intercept was approved, or the judicial order was approved. So it's a very complicated issue no matter what. It was certainly a complicated issue with respect to what was going on in Texas, and now in hindsight, what's going on nationally with the Supreme Court. I will tell you, I voted no. Had I had the knowledge of the way the court handled oral arguments in the case before it, I probably would have changed my vote, because I really didn't believe that the court is ready to strike down Roe, and it seems like they may be. So I also for a lot of reasons, I was a vote of conscience. I would want to know, but I certainly understand why the bill passed. I certainly understand the need for the bill, and I'm glad the governor signed the bill.
And yeah, it is worth mentioning that you did vote against it, one of the handful of Democrats that did. But of course, we can't talk to every Democrat about every issue on this one, and wanted to get your thoughts on it as well. Mark, on social issues, maybe more in general, because obviously we know you all's position on things like P&A. I've heard from some Republicans that they feel that Democrats have kind of gone too far out on a limb on social issues the last couple of years, maybe to appease their base. What's your opinion on that? What's your take on that? And it has seemed almost like members of your caucus have been sort of out of the mainstream of maybe our center left leaning state when we talk about a lot of these issues.
Well, I think if you look at parental notice as an example, it's a supermajority. When you look at polls, it's a supermajority of people support parental notification. So it depends on how you look at if the Democrats have gone too far left or towards their base. If you look at the polls, even in a state like Illinois, or nationally, a supermajority of people support the right of the parents to know. So was it appeasing their base? Was it just appeasing their side of the aisle? I don't know if it was an appeasement process. I think you've certainly seen a lurch to the left in people that are elected in the Democratic Party. I mean, I don't want to name names on this, but I'll have conversations with some Democrats that were elected not that long ago that were considered the far left progressives, and now they're like, wow, you're the moderate. I guess I kind of get the same tag as well on the right, where when I first came into the caucus, I was considered, to be very far to the right. And now people look at me to be as the moderate part of the party. So I think the Democratic caucus has changed, and what happened that's different is you had Madigan that was kind of keeping that under control for a really long time and slowly letting things out because he understood the risks of it politically. Whereas once Madigan was gone, to his credit or discredit, however you want to put it, Speaker Welch kind of said, okay, you got the votes, we're gonna push it through. So you look at PNA, it had bipartisan opposition, partisan support. Usually that means you're going too far, whether it's a Republican issue or a Democratic issue. If you can't get anybody from the other side of the aisle to join you on something, it's my personal belief that you're probably going outside of what the electorate wants you to do more often than not. This was certainly one of those bills, but I think it was the combination of the type of people that have been elected and their views over the last two cycles in the Democratic Party, and then also the leaving of the speaker kind of made a perfect storm for a lot of those bills to pass.
Another thing I wanted to touch base on, and this kind of hits both 21 and 22 and even 2020 as we look back now as we're about to hit calendar year 3 of this pandemic that we're in. And Mike, I'm not asking you to sit here and be the defender of all things Democratic Party. That's not your job or your role, and I appreciate that. But the critics of the governor and his executive orders, his executive actions, not as much of the criticism has been about what he has done. While there have been those critics that are, that think vaccinations are bad and masks don't work, and those people I think science shows are wrong. And to be clear, I was generally pretty supportive of the governor's actions, especially early in the pandemic.
As was I.
Yeah, and Mark was a pro-mask guy early. But the main criticism has been that the legislature has kind of abdicated its oversight. Should you all, I know Mark's answer is yes here, but I'd like to get your perspective from a Democrat. Should you all have played a more either advisory or even active legislating role in terms of trying to manage this pandemic and find a way out of it, or at least understand where the laws are being made?
Yeah, it's a fair question. Initially, it's funny because this is going to be an explanation of the pandemic, I think, generally, but it'll apply to both what we're talking about in the vacuum of politics. Initially, we didn't know a lot about this pandemic. We didn't know how it spread. We didn't know how many people were infected. We had no testing. From about March of 2020 until probably fall of 2020, we had zero ability to assess how to adequately deal with this pandemic. And so the governor, I think, was given great deference on what he should do and shouldn't do by the legislature. As the pandemic has evolved, we're sort of learning how it behaves, how the virus behaves, what mitigations work, what mitigations don't work. And that's both informing our ability to deal with this latest wave, and I think it's informing the politics of it too. So, for instance, if the governor were to announce a school closure right now, I think a lot of us would ask the governor to carefully consider that. I'm not saying that we would oppose it. I'm not saying we would go crazy and I have angry House floor speeches, but I would say, privately, Democrats on the side of the aisle would say to him, Governor, there's empirical data that suggests schools are the safest place a kid can be. They're adequately ventilated. Mask mandates are easily enforceable because the kids can't, fight back against the teachers. At least we don't think so. There's testing available. So I think as the pandemic is involved, you would say that the politics of how to manage pandemic response would evolve too. So, was there a critique at the beginning about how the governor handled this? Absolutely. I think on a sliding scale, he'd get a little bit less slack now than he would have at the beginning. But by and large, I think the governor's performed exceptionally well on the pandemic. I think his polling reflects that, and I think that he's striking the right balance continually on what he thinks is the best versus what he thinks people will effectively be able to endure.
And just to comment on polling, we did a poll in early November. It showed that the governor's approval numbers had slipped 10 or 12 points over that year, but he was still over 50. So he does still have majority support as of 2 months ago now. So Representative Batinick, in the flip side of that, while Republicans have been critical of the governor's executive actions and kind of going it alone, as I think the minority leader likes to say, what would the legislature have done? What should the legislature have done throughout this pandemic, whether it's to rein in those executive orders or to legislate itself?
Well, there's a couple of things I'd like to hit on here. I think it's a little bit easier to get buy-in when there's process. When somebody feels like they're dictated to you don't get the sense of buy-in, right? You're not part of the decision-making process. And when you have 118 different perspectives from around the state, we're the closest to the people, and you hear about stories that are happening in districts, and I'm going to share them with you right now. When you talk about the mask mandate for young children, you tell me that the autistic kid that's been enduring this for 2 years and can't wear a mask is better off at home. I think you're full of it. And when we're going to start following the science, we have to follow all the science, not just pandemic experts, right? So there's a bunch. Jan Crawford, I posted it on Twitter. I beg anybody to watch it. She was on the CBS Sunday morning news program. She did the best soliloquy of what's happened to children over the last 2 years. Let's be clear. Vaccinating kids, masks for kids, all the stuff that we do, especially for young kids, is not to protect the kids, it's to protect us. It's to protect them from being vectors. I mean, all the data shows that. When you look at the increase in suicides, when you look at the increase in opioid overdoses, when you look at, more importantly, the decline in learning. I've said this on my radio show. I might have actually said it on Mike's podcast I was on a few weeks ago. There's a 10-year life expectancy difference for women and a 15-year life expectancy difference for men based on income groups. And we all know that income groups often relate to education. And my wife's a special ed teacher. So I'm not on the front line, but my wife is on the front line. And she's having a hard time with kids that are, when you have a kindergarten, first and second graders that have gone years and are certainly far behind. I'm sorry, this is part of the science. Kids have taken the brunt of this. Their lives will be affected forever. There is some kid that's going to live to 50 instead of 60 or 70 because of the mitigations, because how far he's behind in school versus other kids. You have single moms that might have a special ed kid at home or multiple kids and maybe isn't as fortunate as others. If I have a kid that's struggling, I can hire a tutor and get my daughter or son caught up. Not everybody can do that. And there is a life expectancy effect from all those sorts of things. The fact that we didn't have public hearings on all these things, so that we're not taking in all the science and making an informed decision on all of this is a travesty. I think we're going to look back and we're going to say closing schools for as long as we did, once we had a handle on it. I mean, the Catholic schools stayed open. I had a daughter at the time that was at a Catholic high school. All my kids have done public school except for one daughter went to Catholic high school. They stayed open through it. And the experience from sports, life experience, these take a mental toll on children. And there's a life expectancy thing. So you have to take in all the science, and we never took in all the science, especially for kids with this pandemic. We were taking in, how do we get to COVID zero and how do we stop this, as opposed to start recognizing earlier what negative effects the mitigation efforts had, especially on children. So that was if we were going to do something, I would have wanted the governor to have to watch a public hearing where parents are telling stories and social scientists are telling stories and economists are telling stories about how this affects the longevity of people's lives and the happiness of people's lives. As a matter of fact, I mean, I have somebody that's a friend of mine that lives nearby, 90 years old, that's been holed up in his house for the last 2 years. I'm not sure that's really living. So we never took into account all the science around it. And that was really my biggest frustration, is that we never just sat back and said, you know what, even having the hearings gets buy-in from the public and lets people know, we hear you. We're going to try and tweak this or that. You know, like World Health Organization for most of the pandemic has said kids under 12, you don't mask them. And there are talk to a speech pathologist about how kids are behind with their speech and the effects that's going to have on them for being masked as long as they are. So there's a whole lot of things that I would have loved to have had a whole lot of data on. I would have liked, when we're looking at the data of hospitalization, I'd like to know how much hospitalization is incidental versus they're coming in for COVID or they're coming in for an appendix and then they test positive for. There's a bunch of things that affect the decisions that if it was public and more transparent, I think you would have had more buy-in 2 years down the road.
So let me ask you this though, and you're not specifically in that camp, but you know, the leader in the clubhouse for your party's nomination for governor, Darren Bailey, who I think would be arguably the leader in the clubhouse right now, is vehemently anti-vax. He has publicly stated that he hasn't and won't get vaccinated, even when he had a brother-in-law in the ICU. Has sued the governor over the mandates. And your party, members of your party, have kind of led the charge over this vaccine skepticism and mask fight. You know, that has really positioned a portion of the population against these pretty clear scientific remediations that we know work. So do Republicans own some of this pandemic, at least the fact that it's continued on because so many of your members, so many of your leaders in the party, whether it's DC or Illinois, have been so vehemently anti-vax or mask?
Yeah, so this is actually one of those instances, once again, where I think a little bit of transparency would have helped. It would have been nice to have somebody that's on my side of the aisle that's skeptical of something actually have an expert and have a challenge back and forth and have the public debate. I mean, there was a newspaper article out really recently, a headline that talked about record number of kids in hospital because of COVID, but you had to dig down to find out that it was incidental COVID, right? So I'm trying to think of a good analogy. You know, if it's summertime and everybody's wearing shorts and they say, wow, you know, there's 10 times more kids in the hospital wearing shorts than there was 3 months ago. Well, it's summertime. They came in, they broke their leg wearing shorts. Just because they're going to the hospital doesn't mean they're going to the hospital because of COVID, but the headline made it seem that way. So you do have a little bit of a situation where I could blame a lot of things on this. I can blame the algorithms of people on social media, which push people to articles that want to confirm your bias. I can talk about cable news. That same thing. They want to make money, so they want to stir up stuff. I would have liked to have had some people talk about the real reasons for the. I would have liked to have talked to people about myocarditis for kids, which is a thing. I would have liked to have talked. You know, there's a John Hopkins doctor from John Hopkins, and this was a couple months ago. Early middle of the Delta wave. He investigated, he got a hold of the records of half of the people under 18 that had died with COVID, and 100% of them had comorbidities. These are the type of conversations. It's not like, hey, we vaccine everybody and everybody gets a booster, maybe a 4th shot, or the other option is nothing. How about, well, you know what? For kids, we're going to be a little bit more careful. If you're old, you need a booster, maybe a 4th shot. This person who had, there's that Guillain-Barré's disease that I actually have a friend that got a vaccine for the flu and was literally paralyzed for a couple months. So he's a little hesitant taking the vaccine. I mean, we act like there's like an all or nothing all the time. And it seems like the carnival barkers are getting all the attention right now. What hearings do is they actually bring things to the center and you try to find a common ground. That's what I would have liked to have seen. It's easy to push back on something when you're not having public hearings. If we had the public hearings, I think it would be a little bit harder for some members of my party maybe to take some of the positions that they took.
All right, so let's turn our attention to the new year now, even though the pandemic continues, and we've seen most of this first week of the legislative session canceled, though you all will be in on Wednesday, and then sounds like we'll cancel next week. The governor has said, Representative Zalewski, that balancing the budget is his number one priority. You all are supposed to have a short session this year due to the June primary. One can argue, I suppose you can say that some of the federal money helped prop up the current budget that we're in. Some of that's still around, not all of it's going to be there. What is the challenge in your mind, and as you chair revenue, so you see the numbers as they come in, what's the challenge in 2022 for FY23 in making sure this budget stays on track and getting a balanced budget done in 23?
Yeah, challenge wise, my sense is probably the temptation to add programming is going to be renewed among our caucus, but to say I'm overly absorbed by it, it would be overstating it. We have a relatively young caucus, and when I say young, I don't mean it in terms of their raw age. I mean it in terms of their experience in the legislature. And there's always an incentive for them to want to add programming and do something that would cost the state treasury. So that's probably the challenge, is going to be convincing everyone that in a year like this, when we're not going to be down there a lot, and there's not going to be a lot of innovation in terms of new revenues, you're going to have to pretty much achieve a maintenance budget just to get us where we got to go in 2020, the rest of 2022 and into 2023. I actually don't expect that to be a huge challenge. I expect the approach chairs this year, by Greg's last year as budget chair, as budget point person, to run a pretty smooth process and for us to not have a whole lot of internal acrimony. Whether that doesn't necessarily mean we won't have disagreements with the Senate, and it doesn't necessarily mean we won't have disagreements with the governor. It doesn't necessarily mean we won't have disagreements with Mr. Batinick's colleagues, but I just don't see it being a monumentally difficult budget year. Others may have a different approach.
Do you see a tax increase on the table at all?
In the Illinois income tax?
Yeah.
No, I can't.
Yeah, I can answer that one for you. No.
I can think of a harder.
Going into election, there will not be a tax increase. I can pretty much guarantee that.
I couldn't think of a harder year to try to pass an income tax increase. And I think I haven't gotten a report from CACFA in a couple of months, or I haven't looked at one, I should say. But my
all sipping eggnog for a few weeks.
Yeah, right. And avoid Omicron. My expectation is revenues are pretty strong. What in the Illinois income tax, the corporate tax, the undersold thing that has carried us through this pandemic, stimulus money helped. There's no doubt about it. But in 2019, we became compliant with the online sales tax laws, which allow us to change the nexus of remote sellers, these Amazons and Targets and all that, the Main Street Act. That was a big deal for state revenues, it both state and local, and it's performing incredibly well with this move to online retail. It's saved the day. So I'm going
to jump in on that one. Let's be honest, it's fair too. The fact that somebody who lives down the street from you and pays property taxes to the school district and sponsors the local baseball team, and shows up at the fundraiser for the kid who's ill, that they have to pay sales tax, but somebody selling from way outside of your area never really made sense to me. So that was certainly something that made sense.
Well, Representative Batnick, in response to that, a lot of your colleagues, and I think it's Senator Rose in the Senate that has claimed that the budget is being held together with smoke and mirrors. When Representative Zalewski, who's still here and can hear you, says that he doesn't think it's going to be maybe that hard to pass a balanced budget. Do you believe him?
Well, I think a maintenance budget. I think a maintenance budget this year will be really easy. I think the projections have been coming in. I think our biggest problem the last couple of years between the feds and between projections and everything else is, going back to the Trump years, we've actually had, when the economy was really humming, we had that surprise windfall of dough, which kind of made up for what probably was a shortfall. And then we had some extra money. I think we need to be a little bit more diligent on what we're doing with that. I'm gonna give you one small breaking news thing and one thing that probably nobody's really thinking about that actually helps the budget. First of all, we had a huge return in the stock market last year, which helps pension funding dramatically. And I'm going to go on record here saying massive inflation is almost always a really, really, really bad thing. However, when you have debt, inflation makes your debt less damaging, for lack of a better term, right? So $1 today is worth a lot less than $1 yesterday. So the pension debt, not only did we grow out of our pension debt or grow down our pension debt from the returns in the market, but in terms of real dollars or what it's actually worth, would drop how much that pension debt is in terms of a percentage of our budget. So in a perverse way,
arguments here?
I just said, I've said this for years. One of the mistakes that we made way back when, and I think I talked on Mike's show about this, or maybe afterwards, is that if the AAI back in the early 90s that was 3% fixed would have simply just matched CPI, we would have been in a lot better shape. 3% didn't seem like a lot, but it turned out to be a lot because we were having that inflation that was around 3%. Well, for years, we were having 1% to 2% growth and 3% automatic increases, which put us behind. Well, now we're having the inverse, where inflation is actually greater than the automatic increase. So in terms of real dollars, it's kind of the first time in a long time, if ever, that we're actually kind of right side up mathematically on that equation with retirees. Financially, I've said it for years, Illinois is the one state financially that would benefit from inflation, from their pension problem, not on all the other things, but from their pension problem. I want to be careful there. So between all that, and then you also have inflation is also going to affect revenues, and then you have some costs that are fixed, whether they be state employee contracts, bond payments, all this other stuff, right? So if there's 7% inflation and then there's wage inflation of close to 7%, that's going to increase your income to the Treasury, right? But then on the flip side, when your bond payments are fixed, you don't have the inflation there. So some of your fixed expenses are going to stay fixed, and some of your variable expenses on the income side are going to inflate, is going to make the revenues a lot easier to match the expenses. So if anything, it should be an easier year. And what we should do, and this is part 2 of my deal, what we should do is we should start looking at returning some money to the taxpayers. And I know also Senator Martwick has talked about throwing extra money at the pension system so that we have, I want to give him credit here because I don't know if he's talked about this publicly or not, but throw money at the pension system to actually make it easier to fund government down the road. So I got in drafting a bill that it keeps the budget between kind of between a couple of guardrails. And when there's surprise revenues, what you then do is you just automatically lower the income tax rate to match what you need for the next year. It works out well because our budget year is from July to July, and our tax year is from January to January. So if you're ahead of schedule, you can kind of set where you need to be, and you can have an automatic float down to the income tax rate. That's a bill I'm going to be filing. But those are a couple of things that I think people aren't thinking about. Well, one thing they're not thinking about in one bill that I'm currently working on.
Two issues I'd like to touch on with you, Representative Zalewski, and they're both complicated, so I apologize in advance for this. But we're getting up on time here. Both budget related, obviously, in terms of, and since you guys did both talk about pensions, it is worth noting that the Democrats have made the full pension payment the last few years. So that has been done, even though it's not.
Can I jump in a little bit on that?
Sure.
We're still negative amortizing. We're making our full pension payment based on the RAMP. We're not paying normal costs plus full interest on the unfunded liability. We're approaching it. I think we're about $2 billion away. So it depends on how you define. We're still not making the minimum payment on our credit card, but we've made our full RAMP payment. Sorry, I just want to be clear.
I was gonna tease Mark. He sounds like the Cranes editorial board. The problem with that argument is, and I it's not a factually wrong argument, but we pay what the system certifies. So if we want to pay more, it strikes me we'd have to find the revenue to pay more, and I don't know that anybody wants to do that.
Well,
this is good discussion right here. When you have a surprise bonus, going back to Senator Martwick's idea, that's a time where you can pay more. When revenues come in, you can have legislation that does that, or you can refund it to taxpayers, or you can expand government. The problem is when you have a good year, you expand government, and then you're searching for the money in a bad year. That's why I like the idea. What my bill does is it keeps the budget between guardrails. Good years, you refund some, it floats down. If it has to float back up to 495, it automatically does that.
We'll come back another time and do a full in-depth Ben Stein version, in-depth on the pensions if you want to. But I did want to touch on these two things that are, I think, important, Representative Zalewski, that I think impact the budget. One would be property taxes, which I have argued that for state government to make property taxes go down significantly is going to require a crap ton. Is that a fair statement to say of state revenue to go into schools, which eat up the majority of property taxes, which we don't have the money for? And the second thing is the unemployment insurance trust fund, which so many people that have been dipping into that it's billions in the hole right now. How do we approach those things? The unemployment insurance issue could happen all over again tomorrow, like we got snuck up on in March. Property tax is a little bit longer term of a thing, but it's still an issue that we've got to deal with.
On unemployment insurance, I would be lying if I suggested on this taping that I have a really great idea on it. I think our federal delegation has to convince Congress that in whatever permutation of whatever next big bill that has to pass gets out, there has to be some sort of extension or modified payment schedule or use of ability to use ARPA or a combination thereof to get us out of there, because there's no way anyone expected us to dive that much into the fund in a short amount of time. And I'll tell you, it's anecdotally important. I mean, we're getting evidence from all over the state that their unemployment numbers are going up, that payments are making in, and it's having a very deleterious effect on their ability to manage their businesses post-COVID. So it's a high priority. I don't want to pun on it, but I don't know that.
I don't think that's a pun. I'm actually going to second what Representative Zalewski is saying there. I think there needs to be more flexibility with the federal funds. Yeah. This was a federal issue. It fits in the box of what happened with the shutdown during COVID and the entire pandemic. So I think there should certainly be some more flexibility there. If you start putting it on the backs of the employees, that's going to have a disastrous effect on costs. It's actually going to suppress wages a little bit in a time during inflation. So I don't even think that's punning. I think that's actually a reasonable answer.
And really, even just checking the box in a bill that allows you to use some of those federal bailout dollars for that would be a significant step in the right direction that you can't do right now.
Yeah, I very much think labor and the business community, like they've done in the past, is going to come to us with probably a dozen recommendations and say, please, we need at least half under the agreed bill process. And we're going to have to take a serious look at it. Comp and unemployment insurance, workers' comp and unemployment insurance traditionally have been an area where business and labor have locked arms and come to us with solutions. My expectation is they'll do it this time. Property taxes, you said something that's interesting because it's a little bit of we did this during the Ronner administration, of the idea that if we pumped a bunch of money into local, I'm not just singling out school districts, local governments generally, that we would convince them to hold firm on their levies or their extension every year. I'm not sure that would happen. PTEL is a very, very difficult statute to deal with from a legislative perspective. What I mean by that is once it was put on the books, it became almost immediately untouchable because local governments were forced to live by it. They feel there's a natural trust deficit with Springfield. Even if we gave them a ton of money into their levies, I'm not sure that they would have the ability or the wherewithal to say, no, we're not going to raise that extension every year. We're going to abide by a hard freeze. How do we solve the property tax? We're limited in what we can do to solve property taxes. There's a lot of process stuff we can do on assessments. There's a lot of process things we can do on smoothing of appeals. We can keep up the evidence-based funding formulas, education. There's a property tax program there where if they show performance, they get a little bit of help. It's probably a little, just like pensions, it's a little bit of everything we can do within our ability to get help to people, as opposed to this revolutionary idea that's going to knock everyone's socks off. That's just my 2 cents.
It's going to be hard to convince Maine Township schools to cut their property tax levy in half. Even if you did pump $50 million into that district or more, depending on whatever it might be, that, even if the state had the money to do that, convincing the school districts to willingly cut their levy would be very difficult.
This is actually pretty easy. I'm going to give you a potpourri. I think Mike is right. It's going to take a few solutions, but number one, and I filed this bill previously, you could do a dollar for dollar swap in the reset of the PTEL. You can simply say, look, we're giving you 10 million. You have to reset your PTEL starting at a $10 million lower level. There's a lot of problem. The biggest problem with PTEL is that it got into this attitude of tax to the max because you can't get it back. So everybody was taxing to the max, which sometimes was outpacing inflation, which then after the course of a couple of decades that we've had this, that's where our property tax, because we've had PTEL, yet our property taxes, it's supposed to be a tax limitation, yet somehow our property taxes are, in Plainfield, they're 3% when they were under 2% 20 years ago or so, guesstimating there. Don't hold me to that, but somewhere there in where I live, they're 3%. And Oswego, they're 4%. So there is a way to pump money in and reset PTEL. PTEL needs to be addressed so it doesn't become this tax to the max. One idea is that allow them like a 3-year rolling average where, okay, they have extra money, they're trying to tax the max, but you allow them to go back a couple of years. If they don't tax to the max, maybe they have a couple more years of recapture. So that incentivizes them maybe to keep the rate down and not tax to the max as well. But this may surprise you, Patrick. I actually have a bill for property taxes. I'm gonna break the news here. One of the biggest problems that we have is you literally have a school district, because it has so much industry in it, might be spending $30,000-$40,000 per student and refunding all their property taxes to their residents, while the school district next to it has asbestos. Okay, or you might have a school district literally with heated sidewalks, so they don't have to shovel, next to a school district that's struggling for dollars. And it's the way, when a fire department serves an area, it makes sense that the commercial base goes to that fire department. They have to serve that area. But a commercial property serves a region, right? People come to, whether it's a nuclear power plant, a distribution center, all that kind of stuff. So what I've done is in drafting, I haven't filed it yet, but I will eventually, is I have a bill that shifts 50% of your commercial property tax base countywide to kind of level out. Right now we have not districts and have districts and have not districts, and you need to level that out, because you have districts that literally have money that they're just spending 3 times what a district like my district does a pretty good job on about $10,000 per student. But then you have districts literally near me spending $30,000 per student. that needs to be leveled out. You don't, if we can do a good job educating people for $10,000 per student, you shouldn't need $30,000 at the 1 year buy, but they have the money because the way our system is, if some farmer a long time ago decided to gerrymander something into some school district, and that's where the nuclear power plant goes, or that's where the Amazon factory goes, that school district gets 100% of the money, even though the people that work there work regionally. So I thought about doing it on a statewide level. The way I'm filing this bill is to be doing it at a county-wide level, so that you stop having these have and have-not school districts, because the have-not school districts get bailed out by the state. So that allows the state then to have more flexibility to lower the property tax levy for everybody.
Okay, before I let you guys go, little political, little personal here in the same right. Springfield's not the easiest place to get along with those on the other side of the aisle. I think it's safe to say it's a little toxic at times. It's a little mean-spirited at times, not nearly to the extent that DC is. Representative Batinick has said he's not running for re-election this year. I don't know if that plays any role or if you're just done. While you two get along and you two are both likable, get along with guys, there are members of both of your parties that are less than easy to get along with.
Everybody in my caucus is likable, Pat.
They're beautiful people. Yeah.
No, I genuinely believe that. I don't want to get crosswise. I think the public perception of what people think about everybody in my caucus is a lot different than the personal. The personal.
That's fair. But as you look at the way things are in Springfield right now, and we seem to be a little bit away from the backslapping days of it easy to get bipartisan things done, and there's always going to be dislike at the top, whether it's an Edgar or a Ryan or a Quinn or a Rauner or a Pritzker. But in the legislature, you would always hope that there would be some things that can get done. Is it hard to work with both sides right now? And obviously for a Republican, Mark, I'm sure it's harder for you to feel like you can get anything done.
Well, he doesn't need to work with me. They've got plenty of votes over there. And I kind of want to echo a little bit. I think we need to break out personally and politically with that. I really don't think there's a lot of people who are really dislike each other personally. There's either good relationships, or in some cases maybe there aren't relationships. I mean, there's 118 people in the chamber. I don't get to know everybody as much as I'd like to, but I would like to think that I have a workable relationship with almost everybody on the other side of the aisle. So I think personally, I don't think it's any different than any other field, whether it be working at a factory or real estate or a school or anything. I think personally, I think there's sometimes it's a little hard to get people. I think the political climate is, and what people view as how they win primaries and what they need to do to win primaries is what really separates people, right? So gerrymandering is part of that. I've talked about this before. Gerrymandering is part of it, where winning the primary means that's how you keep your job. The primary is the general. Well, you're going to get really partisan ideas that way. And it's going to be hard to get those people then to come forward and agree on stuff politically in the center when you have so many seats that are, you have 80+% of the seats that are in the bag after the primary. Then you amplify that with social media, and you amplify it with cable news, and it really pushes those politicians to the wings. And you certainly have a fair amount of people on both sides of the aisle that fit that and have to fit kind of those sides of the aisle to navigate things politically, and the pressure that they're getting then from their constituents, I think, is part of it. But I've written op-eds with Kelly Cassidy, and I mean, I think we're about as far apart politically as you can on a lot of issues. But what I do is there'll be an issue. I think she's an honest, transparent person, and when there's an issue that we agree on, I'm like 100% all in with her on it. So I think it's more of I don't even think it's our chamber issue as much as it is just America writ large, where we're really being pushed to the wings. And I blame a lot of that on the algorithms of social media, gerrymandering, and cable news.
Maybe to spin that around a little bit then, Mike, do you care to work with Republicans?
Yes, dude. A couple of things touching on what Mark said. I
Sure.
think I would urge again, I mentioned at the beginning, we have a very relatively younger caucus in terms of experience. And I would tell each and every one of them, you have to go over there and at least talk to members about your bill. Even if you feel like the answer is an unequivocal no, get them familiar with it, get them to understand what it does. And if most of the time they'll be like, look, I'm not going to be able to vote for it, but at least you and I had a conversation. I can say, I understand where you're coming from. That's going to help you when you're in committee. It's going to help them so they don't feel blindsided. It's just good process for you to gain an understanding of what that other, what a typical, I don't want to say typical Republican, but what a Republican is thinking. Second of all, there's times they'll surprise you. There's times a member will vote on a bill that you're just like, wow, I would have never thought I could get a yes vote out of Charlie Meyer. Charlie Meyer's voted for some bills that, based on his district, you would be like, what the heck? You surprised the heck out of me, Charlie. And a person, Mark cited Kelly, who I think the world of, a person that I would urge everyone to when you're talking to GOP members of the House GOP caucus, and you just want a perspective on something, is Deanna Zaki. Deanna Zaki has a unique style, and she's on the floor and she knows how to attack a bill. But she, in private, will come up to you and talk about her bills, and she'll want an honest explanation of where she's coming from. She's achieved a lot of success in her career. She is a very experienced attorney, and I learn a lot talking to her. We don't agree on anything. She thinks and she's really mad she can't get anything out of revenue, and there's stuff that I think she says on the floor that sometimes I would have said it a different way. But in private conversations, I enjoy talking to her because I learn a lot, and that's half of what the job is about in my mind.
I'm actually going to dovetail on that. I think you learn the one thing that I've learned over life, which I wish all Americans would realize more. I learn nothing talking to people that totally agree with me. I learn a lot more talking to somebody that doesn't agree with me, Absolutely. What their thought process is, how they got there. Even if I still disagree with them, I need to understand the process of why they think what they think, so that I can, get to the root of it and maybe try to get them to my side, or maybe they flip me to their side. So it's definitely a learning process.
I pepper Zalewski with questions all the time, mostly just because I want to get the sense of where Democrats are on things. I can write Republican responses most of the time from my background, but just to hear from people that you don't necessarily understand where they're coming from is always good. I've always said you get smarter by talking to people who you disagree with. So, gentlemen, we'll leave it at that. Thanks so much. Representative Mark Batinick from Plainfield, Representative Mike Zalewski from Riverside. Mike, your podcast?
Have I voted a wish? There's 3 episodes up. We're going to try to do one in January, but not being in Springfield a lot is going to make that a little challenging. We'll see what we can do, though.
They're good. They have some
great
guests.
They're really good. Really good. Gentlemen, we appreciate it. Thanks so much for joining us.